This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
Hello and welcome to the UnShaw Podcast. In this podcast, I'll be speaking to people who have lost their faith, embraced the faith, as well as other people with lots to say about the evidence for God's existence. Today I'm joined by Louisa Smith. Louisa is the host of the RE Podcast, a podcast for teachers of religious education, and she is an RE teacher of many years standing. She's also a theology graduate of Birmingham University. So join me as we discuss her Catholic upbringing, her embrace of both Anglican and evangelical Christianity, as well as her subsequent loss of faith, agnosticism and atheism. You can check out her podcast at therepodcast.co.uk and follow her on Twitter or X. Her handle is at the RE Podcast 1. Good morning, Louisa.
Morning, Robert. I love the name of your podcast. It's very clever.
Yeah, it was suggested to me by a friend, and when he suggested it, I thought, excellent. That's an excellent pun title for the podcast. So, from what I understand, is that you were brought up believing that God was established fact. Is that right?
Yeah, my mum was Catholic. My dad was an atheist. So my dad was sort of not part of that sort of religious upbringing, but my mum was and took us to church, and we went to a Catholic primary school, and therefore was sort of surrounded by this notion that God existed.
Yeah.
And I didn't really question it. It was, I don't think you do as a child. I think you just accept the reality that you are presented with.
Okay. So you did all of the sacraments, confirmation, all of that sort of stuff.
Oh my goodness. If there was something that was a celebration, I did it. So I did baptism as a baby. Mm-hmm. I did First Holy Communion. I did confirmation. And that was my stint as a Catholic. I then became an Anglican. So I did a believer's baptism. I think I did another confirmation. I can't remember. I've done marriage. I think the only thing I haven't done is ordination and sort of last rites.
Okay. So what prompted the change? You were brought up as a Catholic and then converted to Anglicanism?
Yeah, I think...
How come?
Yes, it's a really interesting one. So my dad was an absolute staunch atheist. My mum was Catholic and she took us to Catholic church. My dad then had this sort of dramatic Paul on Damascus Road type conversion.
Okay.
Where, he heard voices from God and he felt the power of God going through him and things like that. So he then he went from an atheist to a Christian, born-again Christian. And he started going to a local Anglican church. And they had just a lot more. I was probably, about 8 years old at the time. So the first 8 years of my life, I was Catholic. My dad then became a Christian. He started going to a local Anglican church, and they just had a lot more going on for children. So I started going to church with my dad because there was a good sort of youth set up and lots of different groups that I could go to. And then sort of, made great friends. And I think then I realised that I'd never become a Christian. I'd just be brought up as a Catholic. Yeah. I'd not actually made a commitment myself. So when I was about 11, my dad took us to hear an evangelist called Billy Graham, the late Billy Graham, very well-known evangelist at Hove Town Hall. And there was a call at the end for people to go forward and give their life to Jesus. And so, I felt that at the time, I felt that was the right thing to do.
I'm fascinated by people who have these sort of, as you describe it, road to Damascus type conversions. What happened to your father?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So his half-sister was a evangelical born-again Christian and would constantly try to convert him. And he was not only an atheist, I think he kind of hated the idea of organised religion and really did not like Christians at all. And so kind of took the mickey out of her quite a lot.
Okay.
But I think she convinced him to go to this men's prayer breakfast, which he went to, I think, because there was free food and, that's always a pull.
Yeah.
And he went to this breakfast, and on the way home, he was walking home afterwards, And he was just going, it was just terrible. It was so rubbish. The person speaking had no, sort of authority, was not easy to be listened to. If I was going to do that, if I was a Christian and I was going to arrange a men's breakfast, I would do this and I would do this and I would say that. And, he would start planning it all out. And by this time he'd got home and I think he was upstairs getting changed or something. And he heard the voice say, then do it.
Okay, what, a literal voice?
A literal voice.
Okay.
He felt a sort of pressure pushing him down onto his bed, and then he felt 3 waves of energy go through him. And he knew that was God, and that was the sort of Father, Son and Holy Spirit kind of going through him, and had this sort of dramatic conversion.
I've spoken to a number of people who have had a similar experience. They've literally heard a voice.
Yeah.
Given your sort of current position as an atheist, what would be your explanation for that?
I think the reality is you can't explain every phenomenon. People have out-of-body experiences. People have, hallucinations. People hear voices, and it's not always related to religion, and it's not always related to one religion. I think that everybody that has an experience associates it with the religion that they're most familiar with. Mm-hmm. So I think if my dad had been born, in India, then he probably would have experienced sort of that in a a sort of Hindu narrative.
Yeah.
If he'd been born in the Middle East, it would have been an Islamic narrative. So I think that as humans, we understand so little about the human brain and about the phenomena that we experience. And many people, religious and non-religious, have unexplained phenomenon. So I don't deny his experience. I think that he felt it. I think that he just created the narrative that was Christian. And I think that if you put 3 waves of energy through you and you've been brought up in a Christian country, you immediately go Father, Son, Holy Spirit. If he'd been born as a Hindu, he would have done the Trimurti, and Brahma, Shiva and Vishnu. Yeah. So I think that it's... I don't deny his experience, but I just deny the narrative that he created that explained it.
Okay, so it's kind of like an auditory hallucination you're putting that down to. Yeah. Okay, so you're now attending an Anglican church, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And up until what age were we doing that?
I did that until, I left home at 19.
Yeah.
To go to university. So I took a year out. So from, sort of 9, probably about 11 onwards, I went to this Anglican church, maybe 10, became a Christian, and then grew up within that. So I still went to a Catholic school, went to an Anglican church, went to the youth group, built up really fantastic friends. They're still my friends today.
Yeah.
And I feel very privileged that I had that community and that sense of being.
I think that's what churches do very well, isn't it? The whole sort of fellowship thing and community. So you're at university and you continued
I
go
did
to church?
The first year. I sort of tried lots of different churches. I was at Birmingham University, tried lots of different churches, really find one that kind of I felt that I belonged in.
Yeah.
And I think I was studying theology as well. And I think that gave me the first sort of opportunity to kind of question things. I think particularly being at university, I've been in this very sort of closeted, very religious upbringing, surrounded by Christians. Everybody I knew was a Christian. I went to a Catholic school.
Yeah.
I'd not really spent time with non-Christians. And I had lots of preconceived ideas about non-Christians. The sort of narrative from the church is that they're evil or they're blind or all of these kind of negative things, and actually met a lot of them, and I found them no different to anybody else. Right. That's the reality. There's no difference between religious and non-religious people. And I think it's through studying theology really questioned the assumptions I think that I had, that there was a God, and I'd never been taught how to question my faith, and then I was there critically examining it. And I think a lot of what I believed just didn't hold up under critical examination.
Sure. So are you sort of, during this time, are you, sort of feeling God's presence? And
do you know what, actually, Robert? I just never did. And I think that was what I found quite interesting, that as a Christian, I didn't feel the things that people said you felt. Like, I never felt God's presence. I never felt God speak to me. I never felt joy or peace or anything like that. It was just a really lovely community with lovely stories and lovely morality and something to believe in that was bigger than yourself, and a mission and a purpose. But in terms of actually having an experience with God, I just never did.
Oh, okay.
So I think that if you match that lack of experience with this kind of critical evaluation, it's kind of unsurprising that I came out of university going, I don't really believe. I'm not really sure I believe this. I didn't give up my faith at all. I just didn't have any questions to the answers that I had. And so it sort of started the beginning of a journey where I started to really unpack things.
Right. So was there a source of a moment that you could identify, or was it a kind of a process that was more drawn out?
It was a complete moment where I was in this little reading room. It was the theology reading room as part of Birmingham University Library. Yeah. And I was reading some philosopher who I can't remember who it was. And they were telling a story about a mountain. And they were saying that God is on the top of this mountain and everybody has their own path up. And so, Christianity is one path and Hinduism is another and Islam is another. But they're all, even non-religious is one path, but they all end up at the same point. So it doesn't matter which path you take. And that really resonated with me because I was meeting a lot of different people, living in Birmingham, really multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious place. I was meeting a lot of people. And it just did not sit right with me that there was one way to God. And if you didn't find that one way, that actually you were going to go to hell. That just didn't sit right with me at all. Or that there were people that weren't religious, but that were wonderful people, that somehow they weren't on the right path.
Okay.
So that was probably the moment that meant, I need to start questioning this.
Yeah, but you're still believing in a divine entity at this stage.
Yeah, I still believed in God. I still classed myself a Christian, but I was kind of a questioning Christian, I guess.
Okay, so, but you're kind of seeing perhaps the worth in other religions and so on, and considering whether, your religion has the monopoly on truth, that sort of thing, Yeah,
and I think that it felt slightly arrogant, I think, and disingenuous, because I was very aware that I was brought up in a Christian country. If I'd been brought up in a different one, I probably wouldn't be a Christian. Yeah. And so I found it very difficult to think that Christianity is the only true way. I just that did not sit right. Yeah.
Okay. So you carried on living a kind of Christian life, so to speak, after university as well.
Yes. Yeah. I met. I got married when I was 20. I left university at 20. Must have been, I can't remember, 22, I think. So I did 19 to 22. And then I'd met my husband and we got married in 23 and we had a Christian wedding ceremony and we lived a life as a Christian couple for the first sort of few years.
So he's a Christian as well.
Yeah.
And did you meet him through religious endeavours?
Kind of. So he was sort of a friend of a friend. And so I went to a party and it was a Christian party. So everyone there was Christians. And he was the friend of a friend of mine. So we met that way.
And you carried on through the early stages of your marriage as a Christian.
Yeah.
You both went to church on Sunday?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We went to Bible studies on a Wednesday and, we prayed together as a couple and things like that. But I got depression just after I left university, so just before we got married.
Right.
And I think that actually that meant that going to church was incredibly difficult.
Okay.
Because I think people thought that there was something wrong with my faith.
Right.
That's why I got depression. And if I had true faith and I prayed to God, God would give me joy. So a real lack of understanding of mental health, really.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the Bible study group that we belonged to and telling them, and one person just started laughing uncontrollably when I told them I had depression.
Oh, wow.
Was rejoicing on how wonderful it is that God can give you joy in the midst of bad news. So I was like, that's not okay. That's not okay. Because actually, if he was going to give joy to anyone, why is he giving it to you, not me? And so I left the Bible study group, eventually just kind of became very disenchanted with the church, the teachings of the church, particularly, I think, attitudes towards homosexuality. I found really, really hard. It felt so vitriol, such, there was such vitriol, such hatred that these were evil people.
Yeah.
And I had, lovely friends who were gay, and I just could not put those two ideas together, that somehow these people were evil, that somehow they'd chosen an evil path. They just couldn't. And so I think I just became really disillusioned with the whole church experience, and so I stopped going to church.
So you weren't critical of your gay friends' lifestyles?
No, not at all.
You didn't feel compelled to say what they were doing was wrong, or
no? I could not, in my conscience, think about it.
Yeah.
And I think what was interesting is, as soon as I stopped going to church, as soon as I sort of walked away from my faith, I felt lighter. So I felt that joy, I felt that peace that I was meant to feel as a Christian. I didn't feel it until I gave it all up. It was such a relief.
Okay. You're now a confirmed atheist. What was the reaction of, because, speaking to people who have left a religion, they've found it really difficult socially, in that they lose friendships and so on. Was that something that you experienced?
100%.
Yeah.
So we had this incredibly wide, full friendship group from church, and we left church and then they kind of dropped us. So it was one of those, friendships for a reason. We were friends because we were Christians. If we're no longer Christians, then we weren't invited to the parties and we didn't see them at church. We just kind of dropped out that social group.
Yeah.
To the point where we ended up realising there was nothing. We were living in Brighton at the time. There was nothing left in Brighton keeping us there. So we moved to Essex, where my sister lived, and we used to visit, and we'd made some friends with them and a lot of their friends. And actually we ended up moving to Essex because that's where our friendship group was after we left the church.
Okay, got you. Your husband, did he follow the same path as you, presumably? Did he lose his faith?
I think he didn't lose his faith. We're not married now, and I don't know.
Oh, right, okay.
Now.
Yeah.
But he got very disillusioned with church. I think organised religion he found very difficult, but he didn't lose his faith in God. So I think he had a different journey to me, whereas I wasn't angry at God, because if you don't believe in God, you can't be angry at somebody. Mm-hmm. But I was so adamant that God didn't exist, partly the amount of evil and suffering in the world, partly because I'd never had any experience of God. And I just kind of thought, if there is a God, this is not the world we would see. It would be very, very different.
Yeah.
And I think that actually, so there's always two things going on. There's my sort of personal belief in God, and then there is my relationship with Christianity. And I think they're kind of two different things. They're sort of separate beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think I was incredibly disillusioned with Christianity, and Christian beliefs I find very, very problematic. And then
which
sort of suggested to me there was no God.
Yeah, well, what are those? So you've mentioned the stance of many churches towards homosexuality. What other stances did you disagree with?
Exclusivity of it, that there's only one way to God, and that's through Christianity.
Yeah.
I find that very problematic. I also think just the very heart of Christianity, and I think it's so interesting. As I said earlier, you accept the reality that you're told as a child.
Yeah.
To talk about torture and killing and punishment for sin and singing songs about it and seeing images of it, I think it's traumatic. I don't think the children should be brought up seeing images of a man that's being tortured and killed, and then somehow it being your fault because you're a sinful person.
Yeah.
I think God did not have to make that the rule.
Yeah,
God
sure.
didn't have to say that the wages of sin is death.
Yeah.
And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill and torture an innocent man, and then you have to be grateful for that. That whole narrative I just find deeply problematic.
Yeah, and I think when you're not immersed in it and you're not brought up in it, if you see the kind of tenets of Christianity from the outside, it does seem a little bit absurd. And it's always sort of seemed to me the idea of this guy wandering around Palestine 2,000 years ago was literally God as a human being. And, his death enabled us to get forgiveness for our sins and so on. When you consider the story with fresh eyes, it does seem, or what's always seemed to me, a little bit absurd.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I think if there is a God, could he become human and live on earth? 100%. Like, I have no real problem with that. I think it's the wages of sin is death.
Yeah.
Bit that I find problematic.
Yeah.
Particularly if you take it literally.
Yeah.
I think that's deeply upsetting. And to tell children that there is a hell where you burn and torture forever, in any other context, that would be seen as, emotional or mental abuse.
Yeah.
But somehow, because it's part of Christianity and it's part of our culture and it's normalized, we don't see it as a wrong thing because it's from God. I think that if it's from God, it's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's deeply problematic. I think the idea that there is consequences of actions, I think is helpful.
Yeah.
They should always be age appropriate. There's no way that you would talk to your children about the punishment of a sin being torture or death. I think that's deeply upsetting.
Yeah.
I have no real problem if there is a God could become human, because if there is a God, he can do anything. I don't believe he did, but I don't have a problem with it.
It's always seemed to me quite disproportionate as well that you can live a life where you commit sins and do wrong things, and your punishment for that is eternity of torture, fire and everything. Although there's many Christians who downplay the brutality of hell. And also...
I will just sorry, Robert.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say that I am very, very aware now, particularly because of my job and my life experiences, that not all Christians think that.
Yeah.
I was given a very specific brand of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah.
I think if I'd been given a slightly different version, because there are different versions. I've spoken to lots of people now that don't believe in hell, don't believe God sends people to hell, that everybody will go to heaven because God loves everybody. And that it isn't quite as judgmental on certain lifestyles as certain people make out.
Yeah.
And the sort of misinterpretation of Bible passages and things like that. I think if I'd been given that version of Christianity, then it might be something I would have continued with. But it was the very specific brand of evangelical Christianity where you have to become a Christian or you go to hell. You have to be heterosexual or you go to hell. That version is the one that I kind of it was just so damaging to my life, I think.
Yeah. And, if you don't have this belief that Jesus of Nazareth was, the Saviour sent by God, if you don't accept that, then you're going to go to hell. Yeah. Despite there being no proof that that is actually reality, that, God sent Jesus down as a saviour to save us from our sins or whatever. And we need to accept that fact, otherwise we're going to go to hell. And like you say, that there are many Christian groups who would say that devout Muslims, Hindus are going to be sent to hell because they don't accept Jesus Christ as their saviour. So I think I've always had a problem with that notion of living a sinful life, not accepting Jesus as your saviour, and then you getting sent to spend eternity in hell. It seems a little bit disproportionate.
Yeah. And actually, if God is meant to be just, it doesn't feel that there is justice. But also, I think in certain parts of Christianity, there's a hierarchy of sin, and so certain sin is seen as worse than others. And so, as long as the church isn't doing those sins that they deem as the worst, they can do other sins. They can be racist or homophobic or sexist or, controlling or misuse their power or child abuse. That those sins seem to be much more normalised and accepted in the church, whereas things like not believing in Jesus or being gay are kind of seen as like the worst sin. And I think that sort of hypocrisy I find difficult, although I don't want to judge Christianity based on the people, because all humans are flawed and it would be disingenuous. So I have to judge it based on the things that they purport to believe.
Okay. So your current beliefs now are no heaven, no hell, and
as humans, we create our own heaven and hell by our actions. So I believe in a sort of metaphorical sense of we are a product of the decisions that we make. But also that we don't have a huge amount of choice in so many things.
Yeah.
We don't have free will. We're a product of where we're born, who we're born to, the things that happen to us. So, no, I don't believe in physical places of heaven and hell that exist beyond death.
But this metaphorical heaven and hell that you mentioned, do we experience those realities after we die?
No, I don't.
No.
I don't think so. I think other people do. I think other people continue to live with the choices that we've made beyond the grave.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think there are physical places where we go to be punished.
Okay. So we die, our body decomposes, and we don't exist.
Yeah, I mean,
Really?
we don't exist as humans. I think that the nature of science is that, we are physical beings, and that when we decompose, our elements will, be part of the earth again. So in that way, there is life after death. In that, my energy, is it the second law of thermodynamics? Energy can't be destroyed or created.
Yeah.
It can only be transferred. So I think elements of what makes up my human body will be transferred into something else that continues to live.
Atoms, molecules that make up your current body might go on to become part of someone else's body at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you kind of, it's a kind of afterlife in a way.
It's a kind of afterlife, and also in the things that you leave behind and the impact that you make on the world. I think there is life beyond my death, but I will not be a conscious person beyond death.
Right. Okay, so you had faith and then you lost it and you lost your belief in God. Have there been any instances in your life as an atheist where you've thought, perhaps they're right? Perhaps it is true. Have you had any moments like that at all?
I think one thing I will say is that actually probably now I would count myself as agnostic. And I think that if you go from a Christian to losing your faith, you tend to go as an atheist. You tend to go as the opposite. Because that's actually, weirdly, atheism, I think, is the closest to theism. Because you're both absolutely certain of what you believe. Throughout my, training as an RE teacher, experience of teaching RE and research and things like that, I've come to the point now where I am not so arrogant as to say that God does not exist. How the hell do I know? I don't know.
Yeah.
I am open to the possibility that God might exist and I might be wrong.
Okay.
But I think the only scientific place you could be is agnosticism. And I think agnosticism is mistakenly understood as not knowing. And I think it's very slightly different to that. I think agnosticism, if we go back to Huxley, who's the guy that coined the phrase, it means you're not able to know.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible to know either way whether or not God exists or not. We've got no evidence that proves God exists. We've got no evidence that proves that God does not exist. So the only scientific position that I can take is one of it not being possible to know.
Right. Which is what
Is it possible that God exists? Absolutely. Is it possible that he doesn't? Absolutely. I simply don't know.
You're right about agnosticism. Agnosticism is basically the kind of belief that there's no way of knowing, as opposed to, a number of people kind of misinterpret it as sitting on the fence.
Yeah.
Something which I've noticed in religious people, Christians in particular, is great sense of fulfillment, happiness and joy that it brings to their lives. What would be your explanation for that? Is it all, are they deluded? Is that what's going on? Or
yeah, I think Christianity has some really wonderful elements to it. So it would be strange, I think, if you were part of that and didn't feel some sense of joy. It gives you a purpose. It gives you a hope. It gives you
eternity in heaven.
Yeah, it gives you a sense that there's somebody with you that loves you, that looks after you, that you've got this sense of belonging. So I think that if you are part of a community that is based around the sense of love, then of course you're going to feel joy. I don't think it's a supernatural joy. But I think if you talk to a Muslim, they would say exactly the same thing. If you talk to a Hindu, a Sikh, a Jew, they would all say that their religion gives them joy. Because I think Otherwise, if religion didn't give you joy, people wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But I think not that they're always joyful, because I don't think at any point could you say, oh, look, there's a whole load of really, really, really joyful people there, the Christians, and everyone else is miserable. I think everybody finds joy in something, whether that is Christianity, whether that is, exercise, whether that is eating food, whether that's going on holiday. We all find joy in things.
Yeah.
And I think that joy could be elevated when you're sharing it with other people. We are social creatures. That's our nature. So to find an organisation that creates a society where you feel that you belong, then of course you're going to feel joy. But joy is not exclusive to Christianity.
Yeah. And in many ways, that's a sort of an argument against Christianity that I've kind of mentioned to a number of Christians, that they'll talk about this joy, happiness that they experience, the love of God, the love of Jesus or whatever. But there are thousands of other different faiths that provide that experience for believers as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, and this is, if you do any studies into psychology, the human brain is incredibly complex. And if you speak to Christians, they will say the joy they get from God is different from the joy they get in other places.
Yeah.
But I think that can be simulated by other things. So I can't remember the chemical, psilocybin.
Dopamine, is it? Or?
No, psilocybin, which
okay,
like hallucinogenic type thing.
Right.
Actually, that creates, like if you look at the brain patterns, it creates the same brain pattern as people have when they're praying or when they're meditating.
Yeah.
So I think that the human brain is incredibly wonderful, thing. And I think religion is a wonderful thing because it actually allows humans to tap into parts of their brain that they wouldn't normally use in everyday life.
Okay. So you seem to be suggesting as well that religion provides or caters for, psychological needs, feeling that there's someone there that loves you, that someone is going to forgive you for everything that you've done and so on.
Yeah.
It fulfills that need that people have to be loved and be part of something and so on.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful that, it's not the only thing that does that, but I think it's people that exist that it can do that.
Sure. So as far as you're concerned, what do you see as the best evidence for God's non-existence? You mentioned you mentioned suffering. Is that the main one for you? Because I know that Bart Ehrman, who is one of my favourite theologians, wrote a book about the whole thing. And for him, one of the reasons, well, in fact, the main reason for him losing his faith was that he couldn't reconcile, this suffering in the world with the existence of God. So was that the sort of, was that the main one for you? That just,
I think it's not the existence of suffering per se.
Yeah.
I'm not naive. I believe that humans will suffer. And I think that there's sometimes reasons we suffer and there's sometimes things that we can learn from suffering. I have no real problem with suffering per se. I think it's the injustice of suffering.
Okay.
So I think it's the fact that I'd say suffering is discriminative. I think suffering seems to hit certain people more than others.
Yeah.
And it seems to hit people that don't deserve it. And it seems that those people that most deserve suffering don't get it.
Yeah.
So I think that if there was a God, the suffering would seem a little bit more calculated. And it doesn't. It just seems to, as in,
evenly distributed maybe, or
evenly distributed, but a direct result of somebody's actions. So if somebody does something evil, they should then suffer. And actually what tends to happen is people do evil things and they're protected by society. And people do good things and they are vilified by society and they are made to suffer. And the innocent children suffer unnecessarily, So I think that it's the fact that the suffering is unjust. So I think if there is a God, suffering would be just, and there would be a direct correlation between someone's actions and someone's suffering. And that there isn't. It's just if there is a God, he seems to be really mean and certainly not one that I would get on board with. And I think that that people that believe in God cause suffering, and seem to be not, and that I'm okay with that. It's just they have real cognitive dissonance over the suffering that they are causing. So I think it's not as simple as if there was a God, there would be no suffering. I don't think that at all. I think if there was a God, there would be different suffering that targeted different people.
Yeah. I remember reading a book, I can't remember who the author was, but he came up with a quote which really resonated with me, and that was, the world is how we might expect it if there was no God. The world as we see it suggests that there's no God. So presumably you buy into the whole kind of evolutionary theory of how life came into being. And for me, it just, I don't know, it seems quite incredible, doesn't it, in a way that, life began and there was single-celled organisms and they evolved and we have human life as we know it at the moment. It does seem a little bit far-fetched, maybe, that our great-great-grandfather, million times removed, was a single cell.
I mean, I would say, and I say this to my children when we look at evidence of the existence of God, and I would say probably more the cosmological argument than teleological.
Yeah.
So I think I can totally get on board with the Big Bang starting the universe. I can totally get on board with evolution.
Yeah.
I can totally get on board that certain parts of evolution are just random, that just things metastasize and cells change and they develop, and some of those things, when it changes, they work and some don't. So I think that the design we see in the world is not design. I think it's
the appearance of design.
Which that work.
Yeah.
It's the appearance of design.
Yeah.
The only thing, and this is, that, do you know what? There's a quote by Anthony Flew, and it says that the belief in God dies a death of 1,000 qualifications, because no believer in any moment will ever give the reason that it would take for them to lose their faith. And so therefore their faith is meaningless because they don't know what it would take for them to lose it. So they're going to keep it whatever happens. Yeah. And he says that's the sort of the flaw in belief. For me, I would say that I'm agnostic, but the one thing that I just can't get my head round is what started the Big Bang.
Yeah.
If there was nothing, how did a hot space open up? And I think that for me is probably the most powerful argument for the existence of some kind of eternal creative power that started the Big Bang. However, I just don't think it has to be God.
No,
I think that I can't believe that a hot space just opened up randomly and that everything that we know as reality today happened within that hot space.
Yeah, it's that whole question of, why is there something rather than nothing?
Rather than nothing.
Yeah. And, also the origins of life as well, the existence of the first living cells, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Now, I've always said a kind of maxim that I kind of live my life by in response to these questions is that an answer which relies on natural processes and the laws of science is always going to be infinitely more probable than a supernatural explanation. Yeah. So I'm going to run with that for me at the moment. But, where did this matter that expanded at the Big Bang, where did that come from? Yeah. Who put it there?
And it's, it's a classic cosmological first cause.
Sure, yeah.
But I think that the jump from some kind of ultimate cause of the universe to an organised religion that tells you can't be gay, I think that jump is massive. So I think sometimes people have to take all or nothing. It's like either I believe in God and I follow a religion and I believe it all perfectly, or I don't believe it at all. And I think that actually people should find a middle way, that actually there is something that caused the universe and I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And actually, if I think about that and think about something greater than myself, then that is positive. But that doesn't give me the right to tell other people how they should live their life.
Yeah. You've talked about the benefits that people get from religion, what do you see being the benefits of taking up a religion or being part of a religion?
I think probably the first thing is that it really encourages you and motivates you to think of something outside of yourself. And I think we can all be a little bit selfish and we can all be a little bit caught up in our own head. And actually that's not great for our mental health. I think if you have a sense of something greater than yourselves, it takes you out of your own head. And that's really positive, I think. That's really positive for your mental health. It doesn't have to be religion that does that. It can be walking in nature or painting or dancing or music or whatever. But I think that's really helpful. The other thing I think it does is it encourages you to think morally as a person. You know, it gives a structure to that morality. And I think if you don't have that structure, it's very easy to sort of be, you know, blown away and blown around and not have any sense of kind of thinking critically about what is right and what is wrong. I don't think religion always gets it right when it comes to what's right and wrong, but I think that it actually provides some kind of structure for you to start thinking about things like that. You know, and it really inspires people to do good things. You know, and I think it's very easy to be very critical of religion and look at the harm that it does. But actually it does huge amounts of good. You know, it's very altruistic and it does a lot of charity work and, you know, things like that. And it encourages you to be kind to people. And I think that's a really positive thing, to have that sort of moral compass instilled in you.
I'm going to invoke Pascal's wager here, which you'll be familiar with as an RE teacher, I'm sure. How about the argument that, you know, what if this is true?
Yeah.
You know, we've got a limited amount of time on Earth. What's at stake is where I spend eternity. How would you respond to someone who says, you know, I'm going to take up religion, I'm going to become a Christian, there's good fellowship, there's free coffee and biscuits, Bible studies and so on. How would you respond to somebody, or how would you respond to the argument that it's something that you should do because where you spend eternity is at stake? Because I'm sure there are many people who have that approach. You know, they think, you know, what if it is true? Yeah. I've only got to lose my time on Earth believing in something which isn't true, and, you know, eternity in hell is a possibility if I don't.
I think I love Pascal's wager. I just think it's brilliant philosophy. I think the problem is it's way too simplistic, because it's assuming there's only two options, which is be a Christian or not.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that there are way more options available to you.
Okay.
You know, if we even just simplify it down to believe in God or not believe in God, that actually Pascal's wager says, you know, you've got 100% of success if you believe in God, 50% chance of something bad happening if you don't.
Yeah.
That there's different versions of God. There's different beliefs. There's different religions. So actually, which one do you choose? So actually, I could say, all right, I'm going to believe in God, but I'm going to believe in Allah.
Yeah.
And actually, you get to heaven, you spend your whole life worshipping Allah, submitting to his will, you know, all of this stuff. And then you get, and it's the wrong God. So I think Pascal's wager is brilliant, but just too simplistic, because it doesn't really think about what it is. Do I actually have to believe in order to get to heaven? What is it that's going to get me to heaven? So if you're a Christian, they're going to say you have to believe that Jesus is God, the Saviour. If it's a Muslim, you just have to believe that, you know, in Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. It has to be much more specific in order for it to be meaningful. Yeah. In a life.
But I'm sure there are many people, many Christians, who have the approach that, you know, I need to believe in this because eternity in hell is a possibility if I don't. You know, all I need to do is, you know, go to church on Sunday, say my prayers, do this, that and the other. And that's a small price to pay for eternity in heaven. Yeah. And if I don't, you know, I'm going to hell.
I totally applaud that. I think people focus too much on your motivation for doing things. I don't think your motivation is as important as the action because, you know, it's going to have a positive outcome, whatever the motivation for it. So I think if there are people that out there that go, actually, I'd much rather spend 70 years believing in something that's wrong and then there'll be no consequences to not believe it and then spend eternity in hell. I think, that's only going to be positive for your life because it's going to give you that freedom from worry. And actually, as I said, Christianity is a positive thing. It brings positivity to so many people's lives that I'm happy. I'm totally happy with that. I think for me and my psychology is that it wouldn't be authentic. And so for me, that would be massively problematic and would cause me a lot of stress. To be believing in something for that reason. But I would certainly not judge anyone else for doing it.
And I think the counter-argument to Pascal, God would be able to spot someone who's doing it insincerely.
Yeah.
If it's a belief which is done for kind of selfish reasons in order to kind of secure your place in heaven. So a lot of people have said to me that atheism is quite a kind of negative stance to have. It's quite a negative viewpoint. We are all a product of some accident. We have this short life and short time on earth, and then we die, and in 100 years' time, no one will remember us. Do you think atheism is quite pessimistic, negative?
Yeah, I'd probably argue the opposite. I think that with atheism, there's no ready-made answer to life. There's no ready-made meaning. There's no ready-made purpose. You have to create that yourself. And I think without a belief that there's some kind of all-powerful God that's going to make it okay in the end, it's therefore down to me. It's down to you. It's down to us.
Yeah.
We are the ones that are responsible for. So actually, I think in some ways it prevents us from passing the buck. It helps us to take responsibility for our own lives. And, I had this lovely chat with one of my students, a year 11 girl, who's brought up as a Muslim, but she doesn't believe in God. And it was during Ramadan. She was fasting and she was praying, and she stayed behind at the end of the lesson. She went, "Miss, am I being a complete hypocrite? Like, I don't believe in God, and yet I'm praying and I'm fasting." And I said, "No, not at all." I said, "Because actually those things are positive." And I said, we don't, if fasting and praying brings joy or purpose to your life in this moment, then I think it's a lovely thing to do. She goes, "But I just have a real problem with that. If there is, I don't believe in God, but if there is no God, what is the meaning in life? Well, there's no purpose to life." And I said, actually, if there is no God, there is even more purpose to our life, which is that we have to find that meaning. We have to find the reason that we're here. We have to find the purpose. It's not inherent within our religion. We have to discover it. And it will be different for everybody. And I was saying to her, I said, I don't believe in God, but I think my purpose is to make this world slightly better than the one that I arrived into. And that's my motivation, and that's my purpose.
Sure.
And that's really positive. And I'm kind to people because I inherently believe in kindness. I'm not doing it because Holy Book has told me to do this. And I'm also not doing it for any reward, because I don't believe that by being kind or by being a good person, God's going to reward me in heaven. I'm doing it because I believe it's the right thing to do. And obviously there is its own reward. You feel good when you're kind to other people. So you get that hit of dopamine.
Yeah.
It's not a totally selfless act. But I just think, for me, giving up religion helped me to be the best version of myself, because actually I wasn't trying to push and confine myself to a box that someone else had created for me. I could live my authentic life, and that's been very, very positive. Not easy at all. I mean, I have to say to anybody that is religious and thinking of giving it up, it's tough, because you lose everything. You lose your foundation, you lose your purpose, you lose your community. You lose everything and you have to build it up. But once you do, the feeling of living your authentic self. And actually, you can take bits from Christianity. You don't have to throw everything out. You can there's a lot of morality and there's a lot of Christian teachings that I still live by. So I feel very thankful that I've had exposure to that sort of moral system. I definitely don't think atheism is negative. And I think for some people, it's positive.
A number of people, and perhaps you'd describe yourself this way, label themselves as cultural Christians. Would that describe you, do you think?
I would say not really, only because I think I'm inspired by lots of different religions, not just Christianity.
Sure.
So I've had most exposure to Christianity in some ways, but then I've had most problems with Christianity. So I think I'm a magpie So I look for the shiny bits in other people's worldviews and religions. So, it could be the loss of ego in Buddhism, or it could be the, act of service in Sikhi. It could be the attitude to suffering and the middle way in Buddhism. So I think I'm inspired by a variety of different belief systems, not just Christianity. But obviously, I celebrate Christmas, and I don't really celebrate Easter. But, we live in a culture that Christmas and Easter are big festivals within our culture. So I'm obviously impacted by that. I don't have, a day off work for Eid or for Devout or anything like that. So I think to live in Britain, you are influenced very much by the Christian calendar. Definitely.
Just one last point before we wrap up. A number of people have said to me, and it'd be interesting to hear your response to this, is what makes something right or wrong?
Yeah, I think we just, for me, I'd go back to evolution. I taught a lesson once, and I had on the board as the kids went in, it's okay to kill. And they were trying to convince me that it wasn't. And they were saying things, but it's against the law. And I said, but gay people getting married used to be against the law. That doesn't mean that it's right.
Yeah.
We're kind of coming up, with all of these reasons why killing was wrong. And none of them sort of made any sense. So, and they were saying, well, killing is wrong because you wouldn't like to be killed. And I was like, but there's lots of things I don't want to do. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to do them. I want to go skydiving. It doesn't mean it's wrong to skydive. And I got down to the fact that it couldn't be right. So if it wasn't wrong, it had to be right. And if killing was right, it would not make any sense because everybody would just kill each other. And then the human race would stop surviving. So I think our morality is based on what works for human survival. Not lying, not stealing, not killing. All of those things are based on what allows us to flourish as a species. And so I think there are lots of things in the Bible like, it justifies slavery and rape and things like that. Those things are clearly not wrong, those things are clearly not right, even though the Bible justifies them.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should use the Bible as our moral compass, because I think the Bible is problematic when it comes to morality. If you think of the 10 Commandments, think of the ones they've left out. It should be, don't rape, don't use children,
don't have a slaves.
Don't abuse your power, don't be corrupt. There's so many things that it leaves out, and so I don't think that the Bible, as a on its own, is a very good measure. I think morality has to come from what is best for humans, what allows humans to flourish,
or what allows the continuation of the species.
100%.
Yeah, 100%. Because if we're all stealing from each other and lying and killing each other, then we're doomed.
We don't survive.
Yeah. Okay, Louisa, thanks for agreeing to chat with me today.
It's a pleasure, Robert. Thank you for providing the opportunity.
And best of luck with your podcast too. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.